Thank you very much. Thanks to Artemis, to Jessica, to Tess, to everybody who made this evening possible. Thanks to all of you for coming out and joining us. And I have to say, this is the second time I've been introduced in a week that has brought home to me the fact that I am no longer young. I used to get introduced, and the year I got my PhD was always part of the introduction, as if to say, this is a fairly new scholar, so be gentle. This is the second time in about 4 days in which that year was not included, so I know I'm not young anymore.
We can include it.
That's all right. No, that's all right. It's a sort of coming to grips with the passage of time, which we historians do all the time, just not usually with regard to ourselves. We'll look a lot further back in time for the rest of the evening. In the fall of 1862, the title of my talk this evening is The Center of the Action. Here we are in Washington, D.C., the center of action a lot of the time. Well, it was a center of action in new and different ways during the Civil War, and I'd like to talk about those tonight. The center of the action, runaway slaves in the Union Army in Washington, D.C., and in the occupied South. In the fall of 1862, rumors of a Confederate raid on Washington, D.C. sent waves of panic through the district severe enough to interfere with the tactics and the strategy of the Union Army. Troops defending the city had to be redeployed in order to concentrate forces at the spot where an attack was most likely to come, but that would risk leaving large sections of the city undefended. Troops who are spread out fairly evenly around the city would have to be concentrated in certain places that would leave weak spots in the defenses. The risk of those weak spots, the risk that those weak spots presented was fended off in part because by the fall of 1862, thousands of men were available to provide a temporary guard. Those men were former slaves who, along with slave women and children, had fled their masters and run to the Union Army in Washington, D.C. By October of 1862, 4,200 of them were congregated in camps in the district, and those numbers would grow over the course of the war. As one Union Army officer explained, news of an armed guard of black men defending Washington traveled through the rebel states like electricity and excited slaves to renewed efforts for freedom. Despite official pronouncements from President Lincoln, from Congress, from some Union Army officers, and from many white Northerners in 1861 that the Civil War was to save the Union and not interfere with slavery, slaves themselves knew immediately that their bondage rested right at the heart of the conflict, and they placed themselves at the center of the action. From the moment that war broke out, thousands of slaves identified the opportunity to seize their own freedom, and they ran to the Union Army wherever it might be, in Washington, D.C., and throughout the occupied South. In May of 1861, 3 slaves ran to the Union Army encampment at Fortress Monroe, Virginia, commanded at the time by Union Army General Benjamin Butler. The Confederate colonel who owned them and who had planned on using them to help build Confederate Army fortifications showed up at the fort and demanded that Butler return them. He invoked the fugitive slave law and he said, "You have to give my slaves back." Butler refused. He said he called the bondmen contraband of war, and he claimed that the rules of war gave him authority to confiscate enemy assets. The term contraband stuck, and as slaves flocked to Union Army encampments throughout the course of the war, the ad hoc refugee camps that sprung up to accommodate them came to be known as contraband camps. Contraband camps provided Union Army soldiers the opportunity to interact with and often come to rely on African Americans in those camps. In doing so, they required the men of the Union Army to confront not just the abstract issue of slavery, but the real lives of enslaved men, women, and children. These interactions led enlisted men to begin demanding an end to slavery as the only way to win the war and avoid fighting it all over again, well before the rest of the Union did, until Union war policy caught up and emancipation became an official war aim. The men, the women, and the children in contraband camps, in other words, shaped both how and why the Civil War was fought, and they also shaped its impact. They were at the center of the action. Now, contraband camps varied so widely from each other in every conceivable detail that they defy easy description. Washington, D.C. was actually home to 2 contraband camps throughout the course of the war, right in the district proper, and several more camps lay within easy reach just across the Potomac River. A large one in Alexandria, Virginia, some smaller satellites in Fairfax County, and also one on the site of Robert E. Lee's estate at Arlington, which became known as Freedom Village. Camps also dotted the Mississippi Valley, the Upper South, and the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. Some, like the one at Fort Monroe that I spoke of earlier, were long-standing. They stuck around for a long time. While others were spontaneous affairs that sprang up overnight when the Union Army arrived and then disappeared just as quickly if the Union Army marched onward. These camps varied widely in every imaginable particular, in size, in the number of freed people they housed, in the quality of location, the quality of lodging, in the amount and the quality of food, in general health conditions, in the attitude of the commanding officer toward the freed people, and more. Variables all. Some camps were absolute pits of overcrowding and neglect. Others were the sites of outright fraud and abuse. At a camp near Nashville, Tennessee, Captain Ralph Hunt of the 1st Kentucky, Union officer, was in charge of the administration of a contraband camp. He cheerfully accepted government supplies of food and clothing sent to supply the slaves in the contraband camp there, and then he turned around and he went into Nashville, Tennessee, started a general store and sold the food and the clothing and pocketed the proceeds as clear profit. Disease ran rampant in many camps, where poor hygiene and overcrowding turned sites of refuge into deadly breeding grounds for pathogens that killed thousands of former slaves before they had a chance to enjoy the freedom for which they had risked everything. Sometimes it was the hostility of Union officers and not coldly impersonal germs that made camps deadly. General Speed Fry was the commander of a Kentucky contraband camp called Camp Nelson. He was also a Kentuckian himself, actually Union Kentuckian. Had no sympathy for former slaves, plenty for former slaveholders. By 1864, the bulk of the black men at Camp Nelson had been recruited into the Union Army. So the freed people remaining in the camp were primarily women, children, the elderly, and the infirm, people who couldn't serve in the Army. Speed expelled them from camp with no supplies and no rations, and closed the camp down in the middle of an unseasonable cold snap in a state where slavery was still illegal and where former masters would wreak vengeance on runaways if they could get their hands on them. Private John Higgins of the 124th U.S. Colored Infantry, black soldier, testified that while in camp before enlisting, he'd worked for the government and he'd built a small hut, as he called it, for his family. His wife also worked for the Union Army as a washerwoman. Higgins enlisted in late October of 1864. On the evening of November 24th, by which point he's gone, the provost guard told Higgins' wife and 2 children that they would be removed from camp the following day. The next afternoon, as promised, a guard rolled up to the hut with a wagon and ordered the Higgins family to get in. Mrs. Higgins was sick and implored the guard not to throw her out in the cold until she recovered. The guard replied, "If you do not get out, we will burn the house over your head." And so she left. 2 days later, her husband found her and their children very ill and starving in nearby Nicholasville, Kentucky. Now, I don't know, I can't determine if the Higgins family members survived or not, but I do know that several children froze to death, and at least one woman was beaten by her former slave master to death in the wake of the Camp Nelson expulsion. Some places, in other words, were nothing short of humanitarian crisis. But, on the other hand, some camps really did live up to the name that contrabands gave to Fortress Monroe, which was Freedom's Fort. For one thing, the very presence of a camp to which bond people could run weakened slaveholders' grasp on their human property. In 1864, 2 agents, S.H. Bostwick and Thomas Hood, were sent by the U.S. Congress to investigate conditions in contraband camps in Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Their report pulled no punches in describing the abuses that went on in particular camps, but the report also noted that a well-run camp, by its moral influence, greatly weakened and almost broke the bonds of the slave. The master knows his slave has the power to leave him and to reach this camp where he will be secure, and consequently, the tasks and punishments he has been accustomed to exact or to inflict are greatly reduced and ameliorated. The presence of a camp exerted an influence beyond the confines of the camp itself. But more important, some of the camps themselves were clean, were well organized, were reasonably harmonious, and did in fact provide a haven from slavery and a first step on the road to freedom. Bostwick and Hood especially approved of camps at Huntsville, Alabama, and Clarksville, Tennessee. The Huntsville camp was organized as a temporary way station in December 1863, and then it stayed put. But despite its hit or miss origins, the 2 agents praised it for being nearer self-sustaining than any other that we visited, and also well supplied with a good school. Similarly, freed people at a camp in Clarksville, Tennessee, labored for the government in farming and timbering. They grew food, they built sturdy homes, and they also supported a thriving school. It's very hard to generalize, in other words, about what kind of places were. Some were horrible. They were the last place in the world you would want to be, and some places genuinely offered a haven. And it's very difficult to make any generalization about camps because both existed sometimes in the same place at the exact same time. But camps did more than just congregate former slaves. They placed those black men, women, and children in direct contact with soldiers of the Union Army. White men from the North who often had had little to no contact with black people before the Civil War. Recovering sick and wounded Union troops who were lucky enough to benefit from Abigail Dutton's Special Diet Kitchen in Nashville, Tennessee, I just like to say that name, for example, took their nourishment alongside the ill and weakened former slave refugees for whom that kitchen had been chiefly instituted. The kitchen was for sick people coming into the contraband camp. It did so well that soldiers sometimes went there too. Often soldiers came to rely on black non-combatants in big ways and in small. A company of Wisconsin soldiers avoided becoming victims of an ambush thanks to a slave giving us notice that we were to be attacked early in the morning, as one reported. But reliance developed in less dramatic ways as well. Now, few things elicited more complaints from Union soldiers than the monotony of diet, which probably helps explain why the men of the 21st Ohio Infantry developed such admiration for the black women who had fled to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and sold them blackberries by the pailful. Routine transactions, like buying blackberries in Tennessee or buying eggs in Washington, D.C., created opportunities for Union soldiers to converse with black men and women as fellow human beings and not as abstractions or as problems. Like soldiers, former slaves had hopes and aspirations for themselves and especially for their children. Grasping such a basic fact had a real impact on the Union men in blue, at least on some of them. Constant Hanks was a soldier from New York, who does not appear to have given slavery much thought at all, really, before the war began, but who did have a good friend who believed slavery to be a beneficent institution. So insofar as he'd thought about slavery at all, Hanks would not have been disposed to call for its destruction before the war began. But serving in the war changed his mind. At first, he served here in Washington, D.C., and he began to interact with former slaves in the contraband camps here. And those interactions made him see the question of slavery and the relationship of slavery to the war much differently, in much more concrete and less abstract terms. His own progression continued when his regiment moved to Fredericksburg, Virginia, and he served on the picket lines, where as many as 80 former slaves a day were running to join the Union ranks and to join a contraband camp. On one such day, Hanks met an elderly slave grandmother running away with her 3-year-old granddaughter because the little girl's mother had been sold and the grandmother was about to be. The story of this feeble old woman who would rather risk the open road than leave her granddaughter with no family started the applesauce out of my eyes, admitted Hanks. How could anyone who missed his own family help but ask himself, suppose that was my mother and little one, instead of poor, miserable slaves? If some former slaves took advantage of the opportunities offered by camps to demonstrate their basic humanity and dignity to previously unsympathetic white northern men, countless inhabitants of camps went even further to provide direct aid to the Union war effort. When William Butler, an aid worker, visited Chickasaw Landing on the Yazoo River, he especially commented on the large number of Negroes employed as teamsters, cooks, servants, and laborers, on which the camp relied for its basic day-to-day functioning. Defective grain sacks for holding the forage of horses necessary to pull baggage trains held up more than one Union Army campaign and threatened to hold up the Army of the Potomac in 1863. In other words, you can't go anywhere without your horses. Your horses have to eat. Horses eat a lot. You need sacks to keep grain in. One thing that I have developed in recent years is an increased appreciation for burlap. There's a burlap shortage, apparently, in 1862 and 1863 that stymied armies. They couldn't go anywhere. But the Army of the Potomac was saved from such a fate in 1863 because a group of former slave women in a contraband camp on Craney's Island repaired 5,000 old grain sacks that were falling apart. And when they did that, off the Army went. Quartermaster departments in every theater of the war. Quartermaster is responsible for supply, essentially. Quartermaster departments in every theater of the war, from Florida to North Carolina to the Mississippi River, everywhere in between, depended utterly on the digging, the ditching, the hauling, the distributing, and more of black men, women, and even sometimes children to make Union Army supply and logistics operations possible. Black men and women regularly spied for the Union Army. heading from 30 to 3,000 miles within the enemy's lines and bringing us back important, reliable information, as Superintendent of Contrabands Vincent Collier reported from North Carolina. They knew the terrain, Union soldiers didn't. That intelligence they brought to Union camps was really instrumental in planning campaigns. Little things like which creeks are likely to flood have a big impact on how you plan your campaign. That information came largely from slaves. Sometimes even children spied. A young boy named Charlie made 3 trips to Kingston, North Carolina, and as a result, was able to inform Union forces of the whereabouts of a Confederate encampment, as well as provide intelligence about when and where enemy forces were crossing rivers. Union Army hospitals grew especially dependent on black workers, especially black women. About 120 women former slaves at a time staffed the Union Army Hospital in Alexandria, Virginia, in city limits, in Newport News, Virginia. In Alexandria, about 95 worked on a hospital in the city, and about 24 were employed in smaller satellite hospitals in Fairfax County. In fact, so many black women nursed in Union Army hospitals that the War Department maintained a many-volumed register of black nurses under contract with the United States government, volumes and volumes of them names. Now, these contributions had an impact. Not everywhere, not all at once, not even once and for all, but they had a noticeable impact nonetheless. In October of 1861, a Wisconsin soldier whose regiment had encountered former slaves in a Missouri contraband camp wrote to tell his hometown newspaper that the rebellion is abolitionizing the whole army. You have no idea of the changes that have taken place in the minds of the soldiers in the last 2 months. Men of all parties seem unanimous in the belief that to permanently establish the Union is to first wipe out the institution of slavery. Throughout the rank and file, as enlisted soldiers interacted with the slaves who fled to their lines, they decided that only the destruction of slavery could end the rebellion and prevent it from happening all over again. As a result, they championed the destruction of slavery a full year ahead of the Emancipation Proclamation and well before most civilians, political leaders, or even officers did. And they did not remain quiet. They believed that their outlook should influence how the war was fought. And they wrote letters saying so to their families, to their local newspapers, to their elected officials, and even to President Lincoln. On the ground in camp, enlisted soldiers pushed their officers to reshape military policy. Those officers turned to their superiors, who turned to their superiors, and so on up the chain of command, until finally Secretary of War Stanton and Lincoln himself found themselves inundated with telegrams demanding some sort of forthright policy on slavery. Even if all Lincoln wanted to do was read plain, unadorned war news on the telegraph wires that he checked almost as obsessively as we check our email, he could not have escaped the slavery question because runaway slaves and Union soldiers simply wouldn't let him. Furthermore, by the summer of 1862, the contraband phenomenon had literally hit home for Lincoln. That summer, Lincoln and his family lived not in the White House, but in a modest structure on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home, near what's now the Georgia Petworth stop on the Metro. I'm guessing some of you have been. It's one of my favorite Lincoln places, too. Well, every day, Lincoln commuted past the Soldiers' Home, or commuted between the Soldiers' Home and the White House. And as he did so, he rode right past a large and growing contraband camp. In fact, his family's hired cook, Mary Dines, had passed through that very camp on her journey from slavery to freedom. Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, worked for an aid organization known as the Contraband Relief Organization in Washington. Now, Keckley convinced Mary Lincoln to lobby the president to channel war relief funds toward blankets and other supplies for slave refugees in Washington. Simply put, former slaves gave Lincoln little choice but to take them seriously and to begin to treat slavery less as an abstraction and more as a concrete reality that needed addressing. And in late 1861 and in 1862, Union war policy began to change. Change was gradual, but it began. Congress passed confiscation acts that allowed Union Army officers to liberate slaves being used by the Confederacy to further the Confederate war effort. Lincoln signed acts abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C. and in federal territories. Famously, of course, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in September, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, and followed up with the final on January 1st of 1863. Most important of all, of course, Lincoln ran for re-election to the presidency in 1864 on a campaign platform demanding a 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution eradicating slavery. Many factors, many of which we've known about for a long time, account for these changes in the Union's stance on slavery. But one factor I think we've overlooked is the contraband camp phenomenon, where former slaves convinced Union soldiers and President Lincoln to change their minds and to change the Union's policy. The influence that slaves first exerted in contraband camps continued to some extent after the war. Not on Lincoln, he was dead, of course, but on men who had served in the Union Army. Those men would go home, and 3 years later would elect delegates to state conventions to ratify the 14th Amendment, granting birthright citizenship to African Americans. Now, that amendment marked a dramatic turnaround since 1857, when in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court had declared that African Americans could not be citizens of the United States. In fact, the 14th Amendment marked such a turnaround, it's easy to lose sight of just how breathtaking it really was, compared to what anyone could have anticipated before the Civil War began. For the 14th Amendment extended citizenship not just to the black men who had borne arms for the Union Army and for whom we've long credited with paving the way to the 14th Amendment. That amendment also extended citizenship to black women and children as well. The very black women and children that Union soldiers had witnessed offer labor, intelligence, property, and their very lives to the Union cause over and over and over again in contraband camps, throughout the course of the war. This is no time to romanticize the Civil War in general or the contraband camps in particular. The plain truth about them, as I've tried to say, is that some of them were horrible places, and there was absolutely no way a slave refugee had of knowing whether he or she would be met with decency or with callousness, indifference, or worse. Many camps were full of the suffering and wretchedness that, as one humanitarian organization reflected, cannot be separated from war. But wars bring ironies along with suffering, and the Civil War brought many. It was war that made contraband camps and the escape that they offered from masters possible, but it was also war that made those camps so dangerous. And it was the war that offered opportunities in those camps for formerly enslaved men, women, and children to change soldiers' minds and to demonstrate their own qualification for U.S. citizenship. It's coldly sobering to note that for all its horror, war was what it ultimately took to end slavery in the United States and to expand possibilities for who could count as a U.S. citizen. Contraband camps allow us to witness exactly how those ironies played out on the ground in the lives of real people, black and white, in the midst of Civil War. Thank you.
Thank you. Chandra has no right to speak about getting old. Last year, I was fortunate. I was inducted into the D.C. Hall of Fame, and I thought, man, this is. But then I looked around, and I was the youngest one there. So I guess that was. I think again about this because tomorrow the census will come out, and it has many interesting things. But one thing would be the loss of much of the large number of the black population. So I've spent a lot of time today with the Washington Post and some other places just talking about this because they don't quite get it. They don't quite get how ever since blacks came here in this city, they fought for the rights of freedom and dignity and to have what anyone else could have. And I think this was said best by a man named William Nell, one of the first great African-American historians, who said in 1855, and I quote, a well-known anecdote during the American Revolution. And it was a man named General John Sullivan, New Hampshire, who told the story. And the whites were forming this army to fight for their liberty. And a black went up and says, "Sir, I want to fight for my liberty too." And so struck by the reasonableness of this, the General Sullivan gave him his freedom right away. In another case, a white was going off to war, and he went to muster his gun, and he asked the slave, "Boy, where is you going?" And the slave said, "Master, I want my freedom just like you want yours." Such was the examples that the African Americans have had then and now. And of course, we all know, closer to home, the examples of the Second World War, where blacks went to fight for the double V for victory, victory abroad and victory at home, and fought for that, but came home to no real victory. And in this sense, of what Chandra Manning has given us poses any number of important questions for Washingtonians, for all of us, and for the nature of democracy itself, of freedom and equality, of what it means to be treated as a human being, of what the links are between that. Like all questions, they go back to the theoretical thinking of the 18th century. Did freedom equate with being accepted as a human being, a member of society? Did freedom make one equal in itself? The questions came up very early by a man named John Woolman, who was a Quaker abolitionist. And he said in 1762, the blacks seem far from being our kinfolk, end of quote, even as he fought for their freedom. He said, they are a vile stock. Or when the British Grenville Sharp, one of the great abolitionists, says, and I quote, I am not apt to see them as men. Of course, that wasn't much different than what Abraham Lincoln said in 1862. There must be a position of superior and inferior, and I am as much as any man in favor of the superior position assigned to the white race. End of quote. Of course, Lincoln grew and he did fight later on for blacks to participate, but it was, of course, that racial tinge that was there. And the roots of all this, therefore, go back in the way the nation was founded. On what were these basic rights? How would they be? What were they for people of Washington? The roots in Washington came as far as 1820, when Congress passed laws that gave the Washington City Council power over regulating quote-unquote free blacks, just as more and more blacks began to migrate to the city. They migrated in 1820. By 2010, out my same problems. We'll talk about those one day. That year, there were 6,277 slaves in Washington among a total population of 33,000. All this affected slaveholders. However, the increase led to unease amongst the city's leaders. And again, they began to restrict the movements of blacks. White abolitionists in D.C. came and fought for certain of those rights, but they displayed many of the same paternalistic tendencies towards black. The notion for them was to, quote, for blacks to be pious, to train their children for suitable employment, to save money, to pay their debts, to avoid alcohol consumption, as to abstain from licentiousness, end of quote. However, free blacks remained a steady presence in the city and fought for certain rights, as whites perceived them as a threat. In 1806, public schools for whites were opened for the first time to some blacks, including a man named Moses Liverpool, another George Bell, another Nicholas Franklin. And we can go right down to the Georgetown library and see a wonderful picture of a man, Earl Mahmoud, a Muslim, and one of the early of the free blacks in the city, who was able to buy a house in Georgetown in 1800. Then in 1810, another black, Althea Turner, bought her own freedom. And there were many examples like this. And examples were set, of course, in the black church. In the early 1820s, blacks who had been going to certain white churches began to leave those white churches. Blacks left the white Ebenezer Methodist Church and formed the Israel Baptist Church, a Methodist affiliate, because the minister owned slaves. The white minister were not just racist, of course, they were slave owners. Men like Henry McNeil Turner, who became the head of the Israel AME Church, and in 1862 helped found his own church, led the walkout. Like Douglass, he helped to muster blacks regiments for the war, and he called for his fellow Americans to, quote, extend the hand of mercy to honor our bone and flesh, extend the hand of mercy to bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh, end of quote. It was this model that became the apparatus for the beginning of the black church, but also black participation in their own freedom. Other conflicts existed continually. In 1835, we've heard of the revolts at the Washington Navy Yard. Racial tensions rose when white carpenters wanted blacks to respect their rights to strike and not cross a picket line. But the whites never fought for blacks to work there. Then Arthur Bowen, a favorite slave of a Washingtonian socialite, Anna Marie Thornton, came home one night much intoxicated. He put a scare into his mistress. The police were called. He was jailed, and he was prosecuted. Who was he prosecuted by? Francis Scott Key, the local district attorney and author of the Star-Spangled Banner. Of course, he was a slave owner. Rumor soon spread that Thornton had abused his mistress, even though he denied it. The next year, another free black, Beverly Snow, a restaurateur, was accused of insulting a white woman at the Navy, near the Navy Yard. And the whites went about destroying the homes and churches of the free blacks. Snow fled, and he was defended by a man named Reuben Crandall, who was accused of seditiousness. His sister, of course, was Prudence Crandall, who had been an abolitionist in Connecticut. Other incidences occurred. One of the most notable is the Pearl incident in 1848, which led to the intensification of debate over slavery and emancipation, especially about the number of free blacks in the city. To be short, a free black couple, Mary and Daniel Bell, was said to have connected with some white abolitionists, mainly two whites, William Chaplin and another man, and Edward Sales, the owner of a ship called the Pearl. They had contacted him to ferry blacks out of the city. The ship went out. It got waylaid in the Chesapeake because they did not know how to moor the ship along. The slaves were captured. But it reminds you of a play that came out in the 1960s, A Day of Absence, because as the white rose woke up, they didn't see their slaves. And of course, this created a great consternation amongst them. How can they survive? How could they live without someone doing the work for them? Patrick Henry said the same thing in 1772 when he was given a pamphlet by the man I wrote about, Anthony Benezet. And he said, "Thank you, friend Benezet, for this wonderful pamphlet. I appreciate it. Everything you says is just true. But how can I do without my slaves? How could my children survive?" That same year of the Bell was, of course, the same year revolution is creeping across Europe. The Communist Manifesto is issued in almost all languages. A specter is haunting the world, so to speak. The Pearl incident, when the Pearl people captured, they were prosecuted. Their prosecutor, Philip Barton Key, the son of Francis Scott Key. That same year, a young Congressman, Abraham Lincoln, who served from March 1847 to March 1849, representing Illinois, came to town. At the time he wrote that, and I quote, I saw a sort of Negro livery stable where droves of Negroes collected, temporarily kept, and finally taken to the southern market, end of quote. And Lincoln spoke about doing something about this. He wanted to bring an end of slavery in Washington, D.C. He first talked about compensated end to slavery, but he said only if local residents approved. They did not, and Lincoln wrote, and I quote, "I dropped the matter knowing that it was useless to prosecute the business at that time." Lincoln also met at the time he also met resistance from anti-slavery activists who opposed offering funds to compensated funds to compensate the slave owners. At the time of the Civil War, the population of Washington was ever changing. By 1860, there were 75,000 whites and about 14,000 blacks. 11,000 of them were already free. At the beginning of the Civil War, when Lincoln issued his call, many blacks wanted the right to fight, and they began a campaign, the fight to fight. Lincoln had written to Andrew Johnson, and I quote, "The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled men in uniform on the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once. And who doubts we can present that sight if we but act in earnest?" But of course, at the time, he didn't. Lincoln soon made use of black leaders, however, because he saw the need, and made use of black leaders like Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany to help recruit black soldiers when he saw that the time was needed. One of those was a 15-year-old boy named William J. Simmons. At the time, soon after his service, he went to Howard University, and he wrote one of the first books about blacks called Men of Mark, Eminent, Progressive, and Rising. One of his heroes was the man Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian leader. In fact, Simmons notes that the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw of the Shaw neighborhood, nicknamed this regiment Toussaint's Guards in memory of the leader, the Haitian leader. President Lincoln realized that to win the war, troops would have to be mustered. And in the summer of 1862, Congress gave him the authority to do so. But it did not come easy. Nonetheless, blacks and whites worked together. People like John F. Cook Jr., Anthony Bowen, of course we know the Bowen YWCA, and again, the Reverend Henry M. Turner. And Turner said at the time that the blacks would battle for their beloved country to fight for universal liberty. And he said, "The cry has been long. Give us the opportunity. Show us a chance to climb to distinction. And we will show the world by our bravery what the Negro can do. And then, as soon as we are invited to stand on such a basis as will develop these interior qualities for us to deride the idea and scornfully turn away, would be to augur a self-consciousness of incapacity." He suffered, end of quote. However, he suffered the same problem as did Martin Delany. On the one hand, they wanted blacks to serve with distinction in the military. On the other hand, they supported colonization because they did not believe blacks would ever get equality in this country. In 1863, two companies were raised. Not wanting to offend local whites, the troops were trained at Anacostia Island, now Theodore Roosevelt Island, right out there in the Potomac River on the Washington side. After the soldiers were sworn in, they marched through the streets in full dress uniforms. And said one, recruitment speeded up, and within 5 months, companies of black troops marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. Turner, this aforementioned Turner, served as the first United States Colored Infantry commander, served with that, and one of the first units organized under the Bureau of Colored Troops. In a letter to the Adjutant General of the Army, he called the unit the mother of colored troops, and that in 9 battles, regardless of skirmishes, she never faltered or gave way or retreated unless ordered by the commanding general. And of course, we think of the Tuskegee Airmen who claimed that they had never had an airplane shut down. At the same time, he pleaded for at least 500 spelling books so he could make the brave soldiers good, intelligent citizens. By war's end, in the district, 13,265 white men and 3,269 blacks had served in the Union Army, and many, many blacks had served in the National Army. Another high point of these years, is Professor Manning has told us, what the role is done around the contraband camps, where as many as 50,000 had been moved to the forts lines surrounding the city. And religious leaders like Reverend Turner led this effort. All this led to struggles about the emancipation of the blacks here in Washington, D.C. Frederick Douglass wrote to Senator Charles Sumner School, on April 8, 1862, I want only a moment of your time to give you thanks for your speech in the Senate on the bill for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. Said he to continue, Douglas, if slavery is really dead in the district and merely waiting for the ceremony of dust to dust by the president, to you, more than to any American statesman, belongs the honor of the great triumph of justice, liberty, and sound policy. He ended his words to Sumner's, Sir, I rejoice you. A few days later, the District Emancipation Act was passed that freed the city's 3,128 slaves. President Lincoln, who had argued as early as 1837 that Congress had the power to legislate all matters concerning slavery, and who had said that D.C. had served as a sort of Negro stable, signed the act. Yet a few weeks earlier, on March 24th, he had written to Horace Greeley that I am a little uneasy about the abolishment of slavery in the district. Not but I would be glad to see it abolished, but as to the time and the manner of doing it. Then he added, if some of the more border states would move fast, I should greatly prefer it. But if this cannot be done in a reasonable time, I would like the bill to have the 3 main features: gradual, compensation, and common vote of the people. And so the bill was passed. Lincoln, of course, he wanted the border states to act clearly first. And of course, he did come up with the notion of compensated emancipation. Congress set aside $1 million to make restitution to the district slave owners. At the time, from 6 months after that, D.C. emancipation did come, and approximately 800 blacks, at that time, approximately 800 blacks and refugees had died from disease and exposure between the time of his act and the March and the Emancipation Proclamation in these camps. Soon, Congress established the Freedom Relief Association, a forerunner to the Freedmen's Bureau. 9 months before he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declared the slaves, and I quote, would then and henceforth be ever free. At the time, there were nearly 4 million African slaves in the United States, and Lincoln's action freed those held in the states waging against the Union. Again, as I stated, Congress allocated this money with this emancipated compensation, and in 1862, the Senate voted by 29 to 14, and the House of Representatives by 92 to 38 to approve a bill titled An Act for the Release of Certain Persons Held to Service or Labor in the District of Columbia by Reasons of African Descent. End of quote. Frederick Douglass wrote that it was, and I quote, not only a staggering blow to slavery throughout the country, but a killing blow to the rebellion and the beginning of the end for both. He added, no man could have foreseen that in less than 10 years from that time, no master would yield a lash and no slave would clank a chain in the United States. Douglass also said of D.C. emancipation, I trust I am not dreaming, but the events taking place seem like a dream. Then Elizabeth Keckley, who Chandra told us about, wrote in 1862, a freedmen beginning to flock to Washington from all over, from Maryland and Virginia. Said she, they came with great hope in their hearts and with all the world's goods on their backs. Fresh from the bound of slavery, fresh from benighted regions of the plantation, they came to the capital looking for liberty. The black population of the district of that time rose from 14,000 in 1860 to 43,000 in 1870 as former slaves flocked to the city. Lincoln signed the Second Confiscation Act on July 17th, and on August 14th, on a humid summer day, some months after D.C. Emancipation Proclamation, he met in the White House with district black leaders to urge colonization. They rejected his message. Nonetheless, in his annual message to Congress less than a month before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, "It is better for both of us, therefore, to be separated," and encouraged free blacks to immigrate to Central America. He did in fact sign the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. And Douglass said, I hail it as the doom of slavery in all states. I hail it as the end of all that miserable statesmanship, which for 60 years juggled and deceived the people by professing to reconcile what is irreconcilable. Yet in July and August 1863, Douglass ceased his recruitment efforts, as did other blacks, to protest the continued demonstration of discrimination of blacks, black soldiers in pay and in rank. The next year, Congress struck down its fugitive slave laws, while Lincoln called on Maryland to free its slaves. In 1865, Congress initiated local black suffrage legislation and created the Freedmen's Bureau. With the adoption of the 14th Amendment in 1866, ratified in 1868, African Americans were guaranteed citizenship, and the Dred Scott decision was ruled null and void. The first civil rights law in the U.S. guaranteeing equal rights for all was passed by Congress over Johnson's veto. Still, Congress debated whether the right to vote would be granted to black male citizens, as whites in D.C. passed a referendum denying blacks that right in this city. Congress did grant blacks males the right to vote on January 18, 1866, something that the white voters, again, had denied them. On April 16, 1866, black residents for the first time held the first of 35 annual celebrations of D.C. Emancipation Day. These days offered African Americans in the nation's capital and the entire nation a chance to celebrate their freedom and to express their concerns and their hopes for the future. While Garrisonians believed that the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery meant that all goals had been met, Douglass and Sumner disagreed. Douglass wrote at about that time, "The Negro is not abolished as a degraded class." His words, in fact, rang true. Soon, in Washington, D.C., the rights of all were taken away, and they have not been restored yet. Thank you.
Okay, while I'm waiting for my PowerPoint to come up, so my portion of the program is going to be a little different than the wonderful presentations that you've just heard. It's going to be different because my focus is going to be on Georgetown and the Civil War, and it's going to be different because I'm an archivist, and unlike the other speakers, I'm not a historian. As an archivist, I identify, preserve, and make available the records that historians and others study and interpret. So tonight I'd like to let the records speak for themselves and to briefly tell the story of Georgetown and the Civil War through scans of records from the university archives. The originals of these are on display in special collections. So I'd like to begin by taking us back 150 years to the spring of 1861. This is actually the earliest photograph we have of campus. It shows 5 main buildings clustered around the quadrangle. From left to right, these are Old North, although at this point it's simply the North Building. McGuire, the South Building, which was the first building on campus, Milady and Gervais. There were 315 students on campus. The faculty, which included a professor of dancing, numbered 28. Tuition, board, laundry, and mending was $200 a year. And given the mood of the country, it was an uneasy time at Georgetown. The medical faculty, for example, afraid that Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861 might spark riots, copied the record of degrees that had been awarded to its students since its founding in 1851, because it was afraid that its building, then at 12th and F Streets Northwest, might be damaged. And students began to leave, slowly at first and then in greater numbers. On April the 10th, 1861, 10 students from the senior class presented this petition to the Georgetown president, Father John Early, asking permission to leave campus and return home. The petition's actually a 4-page document. This is just the first page, but I'm going to read the paragraph that begins at the bottom of this page so you can get a flavor of the document. Our presence here any longer would be attended but with little good to us, for we are giving utterance to a plain and undisguised truth when we say that there is not one amongst us who is now able to devote that time, interest, energy, and requisite spirit to the pursuits of the class which our parents, our friends, our teachers, and yourself, Reverend Sir, have just and reasonable claims in expecting of us, while all we have dear on earth, our country the South, our parents and our brethren call loudly upon our presence at our respective homes. The petition also asked for all classes to be suspended, a request that the college authorities didn't grant, although the senior class was allowed to graduate without further studies. Now, we could put this petition down to some 19th century version of senioritis. However, it is clear that the unease felt by the students on campus was matched at a distance by many of their parents, who were concerned about the potentially dangerous location of Georgetown, which was on the border between North and South. And such concern is reflected in this letter written on April the 21st, 1861, which was 8 days after the surrender of Fort Sumter, by Nashville resident and parent William Bryan. He says, and this letter sent to President Early. He says, as war seems inevitable and Washington may be the first place of attack, I am quite uneasy on account of my son Macon. I could not rely more confidently than I do upon your efforts to take care of every boy in the college. But if the forces of the Southern Confederacy should march upon the capital, they may cross the Potomac at or above Georgetown, and are as likely to be met by the United States troops in your vicinity as anywhere else. In this event, so bloodless a collision as that at Fort Sumter is hardly to be hoped for, and a stray bomb from either party would not discriminate between an unoffending college boy and a member of the opposing corps. Macon Bryan left campus shortly after this letter arrived and returned home to Tennessee. In fact, during the month of April alone, more than 100 students left campus. Then on May the 4th, campus was occupied for the first time by Union troops. This is an illustration from Harper's Weekly, June the 1st, 1861. It shows members of the 69th Regiment of the New York State Militia in the quadrangle. The 69th, which was also known as the Irish Regiment, had about 1,400 soldiers. The college was given less than 24 hours notice of their arrival, and the around 60 students or so who remained at that point had to quickly move themselves and their possessions from the buildings on the south side of the quadrangle, which were given over to use by the regiment, and college operations moved into Old North. The impact of the 69th on campus life is described in a letter that was written by a faculty member, Bernard McMahon, on May the 10th. And this reads in part, they, being the 69th, are quite domesticated now and give extremely little trouble, save a general soiling of the establishment. They enjoy themselves hugely with the small boys' gymnasium and alley. A sentinel guards the large boys' gymnasium from everybody except the students. The seesaw for a time was the principal object of attraction. They'd get some green one, coax him onto it, and while in the air, give it a twitch and dump him off. We have a regimental drill at 3 and company drill all day long. Uncle Abe, accompanied by Mr. Seward, Cameron, and others, drove up to the college on Wednesday and reviewed the troops. And that is a reference to what is the only recorded visit by Lincoln to campus. So the 69th moved west after 3 weeks and were replaced on June the 4th by the 79th New York, who stayed for a month and then followed the 69th to the west. The final and only extended occupation of campus began on August the 31st, 1862, after the Second Battle of Manassas, when campus buildings were requisitioned to provide hospital accommodation. And this is the requisition letter which was sent from the Surgeon General's office. And it reads, I find that on account of the pressing need for hospital accommodation, that I shall be obliged to make use of the chapel, refectory or dining room, the infirmary, and also the villa, as well as the new building which you are now preparing. Please take measures accordingly. I need not say how much I regret incommoding, which is inconveniencing you, but it is absolutely necessary. I want to get room for 500 patients if possible. So the infirmary was Gervais, the new building was Maguire, the refectory was Milady. So again, it was the buildings on the south side of the quadrangle that were being requisitioned. The villa was actually a building that the college owned in Tenley Town. Old North was spared from this requisition apparently through the intercession of a Union general, General A.W. Whipple, who had 2 sons enrolled at the college and obviously had an interest in it staying open. Because of that, the college was able to remain in operation, although enrollment actually dropped as low as 17 students. And it wasn't until February of 1863 that the campus returned to Georgetown's control. And throughout all of this, the college had to deal with significant financial problems. Drops in enrollment obviously translated into drops in income. Drops that were compounded by the fact that students were at times stranded here, cut off from both their parents and the means to pay their bills. The college's response to that, not surprisingly, was to raise its tuition. And tuition was raised from $200 to $325 a year. The college also had to maintain a neutral attitude to the conflict, which was a difficult proposition for what was a southern-leaning institution. Many of the Jesuits associated with Georgetown favored the South, as some had relatives fighting in the Confederate forces. And President Early was a firm administrator who understood that any open show of support for the South could translate into attacks on Catholic institutions in general, and on Georgetown in particular, and he worked very hard to ensure that faculty sentiment was tempered and controlled. It was a little more difficult to control the students, who, for example, in February of 1861, burnt an effigy of President-elect Lincoln on campus. And it was obviously impossible to control alumni who joined the Confederate forces in very large numbers, as is shown in this table from R. Emmett Curran's A History of Georgetown University, which recently published by Georgetown University Press. So of the 1,085 alumni that Professor Curran was able to document as serving in the Civil War, you can see that only 218 of them served in the Union forces. And many of those were actually Union surgeons who were sent to the medical school for training. So in light of this, we can imagine how concerned that the college authorities might have been in the aftermath of President Lincoln's assassination, when they realized that the 8 people convicted in the assassination conspiracy included Samuel Arnold, who was a Georgetown student from 1844 and 1845. He later attended St. Timothy's Military Academy in Catonsville, Maryland, where he was a classmate of John Wilkes Booth. And that the 8 conspirators also included Dr. Samuel Mudd, who was a student here 1851 and 1852. Dr. Mudd was the doctor who treated John Wilkes Booth's injured leg. He escaped the death penalty by a single vote of the military tribunal conducting the trial. Arnold and Mudd were sentenced to life imprisonment and were later pardoned by President Andrew Johnson. And the 8 also included David Herold, who was a student here 1855 to 1858. On the night that Lincoln was shot, Herold guided Lewis Payne to Secretary of State William Seward's house. Herold waited outside with the horses while Payne attempted to stab Seward to death. Herold later helped John Wilkes Booth escape from Washington and went with him to Dr. Samuel Mudd's Maryland home. Harold and Booth were later captured together in Northern Virginia, and Harold was one of 4 conspirators who were hanged for their role. So the Civil War is probably the most significant threat that Georgetown has faced. However, despite occupation, despite financial problems, despite concerns over being perceived as being pro-South, concerns that ultimately proved unfounded, the college managed to survive, and the fall of 1865 saw over 200 students enrolled. But the Civil War obviously had an impact on Georgetown in ways large and small, lasting and transient. And I'd like to end by talking about 2 legacies of it that are still with us today. The colors, which Artemis alluded to earlier, and the stone wall that runs along 37th Street. In 1876, the Georgetown University Boat Club was formed, and one of its first acts was to set up a committee on colors. We didn't have colors at that point, and it was felt that they were needed so that supporters on the shore could identify their boat during races. So the committee selected the colors of blue and gray, the colors of the Civil War uniforms, as representative of, and I quote, the feeling of unity that exists between the northern and southern boys of the college. And this is my last slide. This is a photograph of campus that was taken in 1867. The stone wall that you see in the picture along the eastern edge of campus, what was then Warren Street, what is today 37th Street, was built in that year. And you can see that the area outside of campus looks very different than it does today. So the college got permission to build the wall to enclose campus in response to rising rates of theft and vagrancy that were a direct result of the failing post-war economy. Thank you.
Invite our panelists, our speakers, to come and become panelists for a few minutes of questions and answers from this really wonderfully assembled audience. Before I do that, I want actually to ask you, please, to thank Maurice Jackson, Chandra and Lynn Conway for their excellent presentation. Thank you. Following the question and answer period, we have a reception, but we also have a book signing outside. You'll be able to purchase Chandra's or Maurice's books. And so let's get to our questions because I know some of you have them. Don't you?
Question for the first presenter. You mentioned how Union soldiers in general were calling for or wanting the end of slavery before a lot of Northern public opinion was. I mean, how widespread was that? And what was your evidence? You mentioned letters and.
In the Union Army, it's enormously widespread, and I have an entire book of evidence on that very question sitting outside. What happens in the war is that men who have given very little thought to the question of slavery, who see the war as vindicating whether or not self-government works, who see the war in terms of, look, if you can leave the Union just because you don't like an election result, then there's no such thing as self-government, and it's doomed the world over. And so that's what we're really all about, is proving that self-government can work. That's how Union men enter the Army. And slavery doesn't really cross the radar screen too much at all. Why would it? Baltimore farmers. You're a farmer in New Hampshire, why have you thought about slavery? But they get to the South, or they get to the slave states, I guess Washington, we call it South North. They get to Washington, they get to the states that secede, and they are struck by a couple of things. And one is the number of white Southerners who tell them over and over that if you would just leave slavery alone, none of this would happen. That slavery is the reason for this war. All right. Our enemies see slavery as the reason for the war. That gets us thinking. And then they view slavery on the ground not as an abstraction, but as something that affects human beings. And that really, really opens their eyes. Many of them, the book that's quoted, the piece of writing that's quoted more than any other among soldiers is obviously the Bible, but the second most is Uncle Tom's Cabin. And they say over and over, I'm going to paraphrase, that bleeding heart liberal Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe, I used to think she didn't know what she was talking about. She didn't come close. It's so much worse than she said. So the cruelty strikes them. But what really strikes them is that these people are on our side and white Southerners aren't. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So what happens over and over is soldiers enlist thinking one thing, and about 3 months into their time on the ground in the South, their thinking has really shifted. Not everybody, there are certainly bigots, and I'm not pretending there's not. But what happens by and large is that these enlisted soldiers think, I'm the guy who has to fight this war, and if it doesn't work, and we have to fight it again someday, I'm the guy who will be back on the front lines, and I don't want to be, so get rid of the cause, or we're going to be here again. What was my evidence? I spent about 3.5 years looking at soldiers' letters and diaries from every state that fought, from 45 different archives around the country. And another source that I used that had not been discovered before were newspapers that soldiers wrote, camp newspapers that soldiers wrote in camp. They're not official things at all. Officers have nothing to do with it. They're things that enlisted soldiers write amongst themselves to amuse themselves when they're stuck in camp. Georgetown actually has one. I can't remember the name of it, but Georgetown has one issue of one of these newspapers. But there are hundreds of them around the country. That was my final source that I used were those newspapers in which they really talk amongst themselves, not for an audience at home, because these are to be distributed amongst other soldiers about what are we doing here. So those are the 3 main groups of sources.
If I could just ask a follow-up, do you think that shift in attitude stuck after the war as opposed to sort of ingrained traditional racism of white people in the North and across the country?
Well, that's a much bigger question. The 14th Amendment passes, and nobody could have dreamed of such a thing in 1861. Absolutely out of the question. So there are clear changes that take place. However, we also have to come to grips with the fact that, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson comes down, and we don't see a great big outcry among Northerners. Does something change? Absolutely. Does some change last? Yes. Does some of it go away? Yes. And I can't explain the post-war as well as I would like to yet. Nobody has explained it very well yet. People who write about the post-war tend to write only about the post-war. People who write about the war tend to write only about the war. And so the transition from one to the other is something we really don't understand terribly well yet.
Question over here.
Oh, thank you to all 3 of you. I just have a sort of neighborhood question for Chandra Manning. Can you tell us anything about the Battery Kimball settlement there in just west of us here, where there was a battery and apparently an encampment for fugitive slaves?
Maurice is probably more likely to be able to do the neighborhood things than I am.
I don't.
There is a cemetery over
Yes,
there,
yes.
which to some extent was blacks, whether they were slaves or free blacks, I don't know. But
The official camps were located, one was at Duff Green's Row on Capitol Hill, and the other is in what's sort of the sort of U Street district now. Vermont in 13th and 12th and something else.
But it's sure.
Yeah, okay. Those were the 2 sort of official recognized camps. But having said that, not everybody went into the official recognized camps, particularly once you realized how rampant disease and things like that were. So many of the fugitive slaves who come to Washington do congregate in sort of less formal settlements, and I don't know where all those were. I'm not sure if anyone knows where all those were. So I wonder if the one you're thinking of is one of those. Right?
Well, and there are blacks buried out. One thing, if you go up by Howard, by Georgia and Missouri, up that way, there's burial grounds there. But as you find, many burial grounds do not have headstones. They aren't listed. But we do know the one by the police station up there. There's a memorial there for them.
I have a comment to make on the Chain Bridge question. First of all, there is a building there that was a colored school on Chain Bridge Road, unused, abandoned now, that is still in existence, still extant, and so there was a an African-American settlement there. Plus, with respect to Georgetown, the neighborhood, as was frequently the case, black people were kind of out at the end of town in the less, just kind of in little squalid settlements. And East Georgetown, where we now have the historic African-American churches, was one of those areas backing up onto Rock Creek Park, or Rock Creek, which was no park in those days. And the other place is, I once knew a very old lady who lived in Burleigh, and she said that there's a stretch of 35th Street beyond our street that was known as Browntown. But she was a little girl back in the 1920s, and that was where black people lived before Burleigh was developed, and then they were pushed out.
Well, there are many areas that the discussion becomes where actually were the free blacks and where were the slaves, and who existed where, because we have, as we know, we have many houses. I think the British reporter, remember last year, did a study, and that many of the houses had the back dwellings where in the caves up under the house where people live. And then of course there's a lot of myth we have to get through. A lot of people say blacks lived here. A lot of people say blacks built part of Georgetown, and we know that they may have been, but they were ex-slaves. So we have to get through a lot of the, and that is what and I'm just starting a new project, so that's what I hope to do, and I'll come see you.
We have time for about one last question.
Talking about dealing with myths, now I heard that some of the Jesuit fathers owned slaves here on campus. Is that true?
The Maryland province did at one point own slaves. They were mainly in the plantations that the Jesuit order owned in Maryland. The order actually sold the slaves in 1838, so after that point, they weren't slave owners anymore.
As I understand it, the university has those, I think, Randy Bass was the provost, I think they have the records they're going to start working with.
Go ahead, last comment.
One last comment. The stone wall that you saw in the image was, many of you who are old Georgetown students like I am, it was still in existence when I was in school. And when this building was erected, it was pulled down and it was used to build the retaining wall that you see along the outside of the lounge or library. So that stone has been reused.
Reduce, reuse, and recycle. I very much want to thank our speakers again. I think they gave us wonderful presentations and wonderful Q&As. I'm sorry that it's abbreviated, but we would love it if you would come and take a look at the excellent exhibitions on this floor in the Gunlock Room about Georgetown and the Civil War, and also on the entry-level floor in the smaller gallery called the Kurtz area. We have a book signing, so you can read all you want to from the writings of these two folks, and of course a reception. I'd also like to tell you that on April 7th is our next Library Associates event. It will be absolutely thrilling. It will be a reading by novelist Edward P. Jones, and we are very excited to be welcoming him back to the campus.